Tonight's presentation is all about pre-buys, and our presenter is Mike Bush in Mike's continuing series that he does here with the EAA program, volunteering to give us his information. Mike is the president of Savvy Aircraft Maintenance Management. He also holds a CFI certificate, A&P certificate with inspection authorization. He's an author for numerous aviation publications, including the EAA Sport Aviation magazine. In 2008, the FAA recognized Mike as the Aviation Maintenance Technician of the Year. Mike's a member of EAA. Mike, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I'm going to turn control of the presentation over to you.
Okay, Tim. Good evening, everybody. As Tim said, and as this slide says, we're going to be talking about pre-buys tonight. A little bit of a change of pace from the sort of the nuts and bolts stuff that I usually talk about. Just to put it in context, the typical sequence of events that occurs when somebody buys a used aircraft typically goes roughly like this. A seller lists an aircraft for sale. A buyer sees the listing and makes an offer on the aircraft. And after sometimes a little bit of haggling, the parties agree on a price, and they sign a contract that we call a conditional purchase sale agreement for the buyer to buy the aircraft from the seller. And the reason it's called a conditional purchase sale agreement is because it's conditioned on the results of a pre-buy examination. The agreement, among other things, gives the buyer the right to conduct a pre-buy examination of the aircraft. The buyer proceeds to do that, and then based on the results of the pre-buy, the buyer may elect to walk away if he doesn't like what the airplane looks like, or if he does, the parties will typically conduct final negotiations based on the pre-buy findings, close the deal, transfer the title from the buyer to the from the seller to the buyer, and the deal is done. So what we're going to be focusing on tonight is largely this step, the pre-buy examination. Now, my company, Savvy Aircraft Maintenance Management, operates a national pre-buy management program called Savvy Prebuy. You can go to savvyprebuy.com if you're interested. And we have managed many, many hundreds of pre-buys. We have it pretty well down to a science. We've had pretty much everything that can possibly go wrong in a pre-buy go wrong. So we've made a lot of notes and learned a lot of lessons. And so I basically want to talk to you tonight about what we've learned about the pre-buy process, how we believe it should be handled based on all of this experience that we've had, and talk about some of the common mistakes that buyers and sellers make during this process, and how to avoid making them. A few of the things that we're going to discuss before we're done: why shops and A&Ps hate to do pre-buys, how to structure a pre-buy checklist. I'll actually show you an example of one of the checklists we use very commonly that we put together. Why an annual inspection should never be substituted for a pre-buy. One of the pieces of guidance that I constantly hear being given both by aircraft owners and by mechanics is the best pre-buy is an annual, and in my view that is absolutely dead wrong, and I'm going to go through in some detail with you why I feel that an annual and a pre-buy are not substitutes for one another, and why they are about as dramatically, diametrically opposite as they possibly could be. Why the pre-buy shouldn't be performed at the aircraft's home base, why we almost always wind up flying the airplane away somewhere to get the pre-buy done. Why the cost of doing a pre-buy should never be split between the buyer and the seller. This is something, again, that I often see buyers and sellers in their agreement saying that they'll split the cost of a pre-buy. That's a terrible idea, and I'll explain why. So at any rate, that's some of the stuff that we're going to cover and a lot more. And let's just start off at the beginning and try to define what is a pre-buy. That's hard to do. A pre-buy is not defined anywhere in the FARs. It's not required by the FAA. It's not described in any manufacturer's maintenance manual. And there's absolutely no industry standard for what a pre-buy should include, what its scope ought to be, and that sort of thing. I've got some pretty strong opinions about how a pre-buy should be structured and what it should entail, and I'm going to go through that with you. But I want to start out by saying nobody agrees on what a pre-buy is or should be. And you will get, if you get 10 people, they'll give you 10 different answers to this question. All kinds of different terminology is used for this thing. Very frequently we hear this, what I am referring to as a pre-buy, called a pre-purchase inspection. I feel that that's a very dangerous term. It's not just me that feels that way, but if you ask almost any aviation lawyer, they'll tell you never use the term pre-purchase inspection. And the reason is that the word inspection has a regulatory meaning. It's defined in the FARs. And a properly structured pre-buy is not an inspection. It should never be structured as an inspection in the regulatory meaning of that word. So we don't ever want to use the word inspection in the same sentence as the word pre-buy. My firm always refers to these things as a pre-buy examination in order to carefully avoid using the regulatory term inspection. But as I go through the details here, you'll see why it's important never to use the word inspection when you're talking about a pre-buy. And this phrase pre-purchase inspection or pre-buy inspection is used constantly, and it gets people in a lot of trouble, or it can get people in a lot of trouble. Why do we do a pre-buy? There are really two purposes to a pre-buy. The first is to help the buyer determine whether or not he wants to buy the airplane. And the second is, if he does decide he wants to buy the airplane, what he's going to pay for it. And by that I mean, when you do a pre-buy on an aircraft, you almost always uncover various discrepancies. And then the job is to figure out which of those discrepancies should be repaired at the seller's expense, and which of those discrepancies should be the buyer's responsibility. And part of what we do when we manage a pre-buy is to triage, if you will, the pre-buy findings and make recommendations as to which of those discrepancies should be corrected by the seller, and which should be the responsibility of the buyer. How that works normally gets defined, or should be defined, in the conditional purchase sale agreement. The way we recommend doing it is that the basic rule is that the seller should be responsible for the cost of correcting any airworthiness discrepancies and any inoperative equipment that is listed on the aircraft's equipment list but doesn't work, and that the buyer should be responsible for everything else. An airworthiness discrepancy is defined as a discrepancy that, if not corrected, would prevent an annual inspection on that aircraft from being signed off as airworthy. And the basic idea is that if you're buying a used airplane, it's a used airplane. You are not entitled to a perfect airplane, but you are entitled to an airworthy airplane. So the seller should be responsible for correcting any discrepancies that make the aircraft unairworthy. But anything else, anything cosmetic, anything that's normal wear and tear, that sort of thing, is the responsibility of the buyer. Welcome to the world of owning an aircraft. Another piece of advice that you hear constantly, as I said, from both from aircraft owners and from mechanics, is that the best pre-buy is an annual inspection. And in my view, that is terrible advice, because a pre-buy and an annual inspection have vastly different objectives, and vastly and the procedures are vastly different. And this is such an important point that I'm going to go through it in considerable detail with you right now. But just to start out with, just to sort of give you an overview, during an annual inspection, and I'm an IA, and so I have to deal with doing annual inspections. We have to inspect essentially everything on the aircraft to make sure that it's airworthy. We have to inspect brake discs, brake pads, wheel bearings, cable tensions, a zillion other small ticket items that have to be inspected during an annual inspection, but would have absolutely no effect on whether the buyer chooses to buy the airplane or walk away, and really no significant effect over what price the aircraft changes hands at. During a pre-buy, we don't want to waste the buyer's money looking at these little things, because they're not relevant to the buyer's purchase decision or his final price negotiations. We don't want to bother him with a bunch of $50 discrepancies or even $500 discrepancies. We want to protect him from the $5,000 and $50,000 discrepancies. That's really what the pre-buy is all about. And because he doesn't know whether or not he wants to buy this airplane yet, that's part of what the pre-buy is all about. We don't want him spending a lot of money on a pre-buy for an aircraft that he ultimately may decide to walk away from. So the whole mindset during a pre-buy is completely different than during an annual inspection. During an annual inspection, we're making an airworthiness determination of the aircraft, and that involves all kinds of things, from big things to little bitty things. During a pre-buy, we want to focus on the big showstoppers, the things that would either cause the buyer to want to walk away from the deal, or would have a substantial effect on the price at which the aircraft changes hands. That's the mindset. That's the focus when we're doing a pre-buy. During a pre-buy, we often will skip looking at lots of things that we would have to look at during an annual, like the brake discs and stuff. Who cares? You know, they're not expensive. They're not significant. But we often look at things that we wouldn't look at in an annual. I mean, for example, if the logbook research on an aircraft reveals that it has been inactive for a significant period of time, or relatively have relatively low activity, and the aircraft lives in an area of moderate or high corrosion risk, when we're doing a pre-buy, we're very concerned about the condition of the cam and lifters. We're not concerned during an annual, because nobody ever fell out of the sky because of a corroded cam or corroded lifters. And sooner or later, if that problem exists, it's going to show up as metal in the oil filter. And then the engine will have to be torn down. And we're not in a hurry to find that out, because this isn't a safety of flight issue, but it's a huge safety of wallet issue. During a pre-buy, it's completely different. If the engine of an airplane has a corrosion-pitted cam or spalled lifters, and we don't catch it during a pre-buy, then it's the buyer who's going to have to pay for the tear down, not the seller. So although this is something that is totally unimportant during an annual, because it's not a safety of flight issue, it is massively important during a pre-buy. So we will often, based on logbook review and finding out what the activity level of the airplane is and where it's lived. If the airplane was living in Denver, we don't worry so much about this. If it was living in Florida, it's a massive concern. But we'll often pull lifters or attempt to visualize the cam with a borescope or things like that would never be done during an annual, but are super important to be done during a pre-buy. So pre-buys and annuals are just as different as different as night and day. And I sort of have summarized this in a matrix, which actually I can't present to you as a matrix, but I'll present to you as a series of slides here to highlight the difference between an annual and a pre-buy, just so you understand how radically different they are. In an annual inspection, the owner selects the shop or mechanic, manages the annual, and pays for the inspection. And whereas in a pre-buy, it's the buyer, the prospective buyer, that selects the shop or mechanic, manages, and pays for the pre-buy exam. So annuals are done by aircraft owners. Pre-buys are done by prospective buyers. In an annual, the scope and detail is defined by regulation, Part 43, Appendix D, or by the manufacturer's maintenance manual if the annual is done in accordance with the manufacturer's annual checklist. In the case of a pre-buy, the scope and detail is not defined by regulation or a manufacturer or anybody else for that matter, and is solely at the discretion of the buyer. Now, when we manage pre-buys, we provide the pre-buy shop with a specific checklist and define the scope and detail. But it's totally at the discretion of the buyer who is paying for the pre-buy. Whereas with an annual inspection, it's controlled by regulation. You can't put an airplane in for an annual and tell a mechanic, I want you to look at this and I don't want you to look at that. What he has to look at is defined by regulation, not by the guy who's paying the bill. In an annual, by regulation, the inspecting mechanic must attempt to discover all airworthiness items and other discrepancies, whether they're $5 discrepancies or whether they're $50,000 discrepancies. But in a pre-buy, as we talked about, we're only interested in big-ticket discrepancies that could affect the buyer's purchase decision or the final negotiated price that the aircraft changes hands at. In the case of an annual, and this is a really important thing, an annual always results in a logbook entry that approves or disapproves the aircraft for return to service. And if you're doing an annual inspection and not doing the repairs, then the annual has to be signed off as unairworthy with a list of discrepancies. But all this becomes part of the aircraft's maintenance records. In the case of a pre-buy, the pre-buy should never result in a logbook entry, or at least any kind of significant logbook entry. Often it results in a logbook entry that says we did an oil change. But the pre-buy should always be a non-event as far as the regulations and the FAA and the logbooks are concerned. And the only time that a pre-buy should result in any kind of substantial logbook entry is if the buyer elects to buy the aircraft and then subsequently convert the pre-buy into an annual, which we do sometimes. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But normally a pre-buy is a non-event, and it does not result in any kind of a logbook entry that would let somebody reviewing the logs know that a pre-buy was done or know that what the findings of the pre-buy are. The pre-buy is solely information for the benefit of the buyer, and doesn't belong anywhere in the logbooks. Once an annual is begun, it must continue to completion. And if you interrupt it before it's completed, then the aircraft has to receive an unairworthy sign-off in the logbook. A pre-buy can terminate any time the buyer wants to terminate it. If a showstopper shows up that prompts the buyer to walk away from the deal, the pre-buy just gets stopped right where it is and doesn't continue. And as we'll talk about, we intentionally structure the pre-buy checklist in order to try to maximize the chance that we will find any big showstoppers very early, so that if the airplane does have a big showstopper, we can terminate the pre-buy early and let the buyer walk away without having to have invested any more money into the pre-buy than he needs to. So again, annuals always have to go to completion, and if you interrupt them for some reason, there has to be an unairworthy sign off in the logbook, and that's something obviously a seller would not particularly appreciate. Whereas pre-buys should be structured as non-events as far as the regulations are concerned, and should never result in anything of significance showing up in the logbooks. The pre-buy is strictly the buyer's show. The buyer's paying for it. It's solely for his benefit. He gets to choose the shop or mechanic who's going to do the pre-buy. He gets to define the scope and detail of what he wants looked at. He decides when to pull the plug on it, and the results should never be logged. It's very, very important, and this is again a mistake that we see buyers make constantly. A pre-buy is worthless unless it is independent. And by independent, what I mean is this. The shop or mechanic that the buyer chooses to do the pre-buy needs to have extensive experience in that particular make and model, needs to have never worked on the aircraft before, and needs to have no prior relationship with the seller, the seller's mechanic, or if there's a buyer involved in the transaction, the seller's broker. In other words, the shop or mechanic that is chosen to do the pre-buy must approach the aircraft from a complete standpoint of skepticism. If a pre-buy is done by a shop that has worked on the aircraft before, particularly if it's signed off an annual on the aircraft, then the shop basically has a stake in finding the aircraft in favorable condition. Because if they find the aircraft in bad condition, then they're basically indicting their own work and indicting their own annual inspection. So in order for the pre-buy to have any value at all, it has to be done by somebody who has no relationship to the aircraft and no relationship to the seller, and can approach the pre-buy from a totally independent and a sort of skeptical attitude. Normally, this requires that the aircraft be ferried to another airport. And in our experience, the further away that airport is, the better. Now, of course, the sellers aren't thrilled about having their airplanes taken halfway across the country for a pre-buy. So we use what we call the 1 hour rule. We urge our clients, who are always buyers, to get the seller to agree to having a pre-buy done at a shop of the buyer's choice within a 1 hour flying time radius of the aircraft's home base, or wherever it is sitting. Sometimes it's sitting at the broker's office rather than the seller's. But we ask the sellers to agree to giving the buyer a 1 hour flying time radius in order to find a shop to do the pre-buy. And of course, that radius increases the faster the airplane is. So we can go quite a bit further away if we're doing a pre-buy on a Cessna 421 than if we're doing a pre-buy on a Cessna 172. But the 1 hour rule seems to be a good compromise that gives the buyer sufficient flexibility, but is normally acceptable to sellers where they don't feel that there's a tremendous risk of flying the airplane halfway across the country and then leaving it, getting it stranded there or something. Again, talking about this issue of an annual inspection, if a buyer were to agree to have an annual inspection done by the seller at a shop chosen by the seller, say 45 minutes flying time away from home base, if you were the seller, how would you feel about that happening, knowing that if the annual inspection uncovered some significant airworthiness issue, your aircraft could be stuck, grounded at this distant shop that you didn't get to choose, and basically be held hostage until you pay some repair bill to fix the problem. No seller in his right mind would agree to that if he really thought it through carefully. A lot of sellers do agree to it because they don't know any better. But there are just tons of horror stories of aircraft that got flown somewhere for a pre-buy, and then the next thing that happens is a problem, a big expensive problem gets found, the buyer walks away, and the seller is stuck with his aircraft in some shop he didn't get to choose at a considerable distance away, that he can't fly home unless he agrees to have the repair done. So this is definitely not something that any seller who is thinking this stuff through carefully should agree to. That's why we never ever structure a pre-buy to be an inspection where an airworthiness determination, a regulatory airworthiness determination is being found. That can create all sorts of issues. That's why pre-buy should never be structured as an inspection in the way that word is defined in the FARs. It should never be an airworthiness determination from a regulatory standpoint, and should never result in a logbook entry for anything more than an oil change. Basically, it should be a maintenance non-event. It should be a simple look-see. It's like you asked a mechanic to come over and say, "Hey Joe, would you look at this and tell me what you think?" That's not a maintenance event. That doesn't trigger logbook entries. That can't get your aircraft grounded. But if you structure it as an inspection, and particularly as an annual inspection, then all of those things can happen, and it can create all sorts of problems. However, it frequently makes sense for a buyer to convert the pre-buy into an annual inspection, but only after he has closed the deal and taken title to the aircraft. If the buyer decides to buy the airplane after seeing the pre-buy results, and the annual is due within the next couple of months, it often makes sense to ask the pre-buy shop to convert the pre-buy into an annual, because the airplane's already opened up, and a lot of the inspection that would have to be done in an annual has already been done as part of the pre-buy. So usually converting a pre-buy into an annual just involves looking for all the little things that you didn't look for during the pre-buy, and doing the paperwork that causes it to be an annual inspection. But the decision to do that is only made after the deal is closed and the buyer becomes the new owner of the aircraft. Now he can convert the thing into an annual. But the pre-buy should never be structured as an annual from the beginning. It should only become an annual once the deal is closed and title of the aircraft has changed hands. Another mistake that I often see are agreements where the buyer and seller agree to split the cost of the pre-buy. Again, this is a really bad idea. And the reason it's a bad idea is because if the seller is paying for any part of the pre-buy, then the seller will want and expect to have some control over who performs the pre-buy and what it entails, what the scope and detail is. And that is always a bad idea. The pre-buy is strictly the buyer's show. It's strictly for the benefit of the buyer. And the buyer should never allow the seller to have any control over either who does the pre-buy or what is to be inspected or not inspected during the pre-buy. And so if you don't want the seller to be meddling with the pre-buy, which the buyer doesn't because he wants it to be independent, then the buyer has to pay for 100% of the pre-buy. Otherwise, he loses control of the situation. I mentioned at the beginning that shops hate to do pre-buys. And the reason shops hate to do pre-buys is it's a very weird kind of transaction. It's an examination that's being paid for and controlled by somebody who doesn't own the airplane. And in a way, it can be a lose-lose situation for the shop. If the shop misses something serious during the pre-buy, something expensive, and then the buyer discovers it later, maybe at the next annual inspection or something, then the buyer may well go back to the shop and sue them for negligence and said, hey, you should have caught this, and the fact that you didn't catch it cost me, $50,000. On the other hand, if the shop does find something bad with the airplane and the buyer walks away, then the shop may very well not get paid. And really won't have very much recourse because the buyer doesn't own the airplane, so the shop can't really put a mechanic's lien on the airplane and force the buyer to pay for it. The seller, the only thing the shop could do is go after the seller, and the seller shouldn't be paying for the pre-buy because the deal was that the buyer paid for the pre-buy. So there are just a lot of things about these pre-buys that make shops very uncomfortable, and legitimately so. And some shops just won't agree to do them. The more the thing can be structured for the shop, so that they don't have to make decisions as to what to look at and what not to look at. If the buyer can lay out precisely what he wants the pre-buy to cover, that helps eliminate the likelihood that the shop is going to get sued and that sort of thing. And so we're always very, very careful whenever we manage a pre-buy to provide the shop with a very, very specific checklist of exactly what we want them to check. So that they aren't responsible for deciding what the scope of the pre-buy is. Again, if it's an annual inspection, the scope is well defined. If it's a pre-buy, it could be anything that the buyer wants. The checklists that we create for the pre-buys we manage are structured into two phases. And I'll show you just sort of a quick example of one of them in a minute. But we structure our checklists into two phases. Normally, phase one covers the power plant, meaning the engine and propeller, and pretty much firewall forward, and a detailed review of the aircraft maintenance records, looking for things like airworthiness directive compliance and life-limited items, if there are any, and that sort of thing. And then phase 2 covers the rest of the airplane, the airframe, the cabin, the landing gear. The reason we structure it this way is because phase 1, the power plant and the maintenance records, allows us to discover most of the really high-ticket discrepancies without doing very much disassembly. In other words, we get the most bang for the buck by structuring it that way. Because if we run into a problem with the power plant or the maintenance records, and the power plant, all it requires is pulling a couple of cowls to get total access to firewall forward. Or if we run into issues with some expensive AD that wasn't complied with, we may not want to go any further. We may want, the buyer may want to bail out right then and there. The stuff in phase 2 tends to be more labor intensive and tends to require more work in order to uncover the problems. So we structure the pre-buys in 2 phases this way, in order to try to discover as many big ticket things early as we possibly can, in order to give the buyer who's doing the pre-buy an opportunity to pull the plug and cut his losses early if it turns out that the airplane has serious problems. And just so, and the instructions that we give to the shop are, well, I'll show it to you. This is the pre-buy checklist that we use for Cirruses, SR20s, SR22s, and we do probably more pre-buys of Cirruses than any other make and model, although we do pre-buys on just about everything. But at the very top of the pre-buy checklist that we provide to the shop, it explains that this is a 2-phase checklist, that we want the shop to perform the phase 1 items and then provide us with the results before proceeding with phase 2, so that we can make a decision based on the phase 1 findings whether we even want to proceed to phase 2. And it says if there are any high cost issues noted during phase 1, we may need to terminate the pre-buy examination early. We also, at the very beginning, tell the shop what we expect this checklist to require in terms of labor hours, so they understand that we're not looking for them to do a 20 or 30 hour inspection on this airplane the way they would if they were doing an annual. In this case, on the Cirruses, we expect normally that the pre-buy exam will take 8 hours if it's non-turbocharged and 10 hours if it's turbocharged. And we tell them that up front so that they get, again, a better understanding of exactly what we're looking for here. We're not looking for an annual. We're looking for a very targeted examination that's looking for important high-ticket airworthiness type issues only. And then we get into phase 1, and phase 1 includes an operational and functional check. That's basically a run-up, inspection of the engine and propeller, which is collectively called the power plant, and an inspection of the maintenance records. And that's what we cover in phase 1. When they're finished with that part of it, we ask them to stop and report back to us their findings, and then we go over those findings with the buyer and make a determination as to whether the buyer wants to proceed with phase 2. And then phase 2 includes landing gear, wheels, brakes, items inside the cabin, you know, the avionics, all that stuff, and airframe items, wings, tail, control surfaces, all that kind of stuff. So that's how we structure the checklist, and we think that gives the buyer the best bang for the buck in terms of finding out as quickly as possible with the least expenditure possible what the significant condition of the aircraft is, and whether there are any high-ticket airworthiness issues or big showstoppers that will either stand in the way of the sale going through, or will have a significant effect on the final price of the aircraft. So finally, just some key takeaways, just to review some of the stuff we've talked about, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. A pre-buy isn't an inspection. You should never use that word in connection with it. We don't treat it as an inspection. We don't make any kind of regulatory airworthiness determinations. We don't make logbook entries. An annual inspection is not a valid substitute for a pre-buy. The pre-buy must be independent. It must be done by somebody who has no dog in the fight, has not worked on the airplane before, doesn't have any kind of relationship with the seller, with the seller's broker, the seller's mechanic. He's totally independent of the aircraft and the seller. It normally should be done away from home base to assure that it is independent, and we try to get sellers to agree to a 1 hour flying time radius to allow the buyer to choose a shop within that distance from home base. It should always be paid for by the seller. Should never. That's a mistake. Pre-buy should always be paid for by the buyer. I'm sorry, that slide is wrong. And never the cost should never be split with the seller because of loss of control issues. It should focus strictly on big ticket stuff, and we like to do it in 2 phases in order to try to get the most significant discrepancies found early in the game. So Tim, that's pretty much all the material I have, and why don't we open it up for Q&A, and then when we're done with the Q&A, I've got a couple other quick things to go over.
Fantastic, Mike. Thank you so much. We got some questions that have come in here, and I believe they're going to continue to come in. So let's get right into it. Adrian, I was just wondering, how about avionics? He didn't see it mentioned in either one of your phases.
Well, the avionics come in 2 different ways. The actual examination of anything inside the cabin is done during phase 2, where we deal with the inside the cabin stuff. But I'm really glad you asked that question, because I forgot to discuss, and this really should have been part of the discussion, that every pre-buy also includes a test flight. We will often try, if it's feasible, to combine the test flight with the ferry flight. In other words, the flight of the aircraft from its home base to the pre-buy shop. We'll often try to make that flight also the test flight. Typically, the pilot in command on that test flight is going to either be the seller or a CFI designated by the seller in order to meet his insurance requirements. But we try to make sure the guy in the right seat is either the buyer, if the pre-buy is being conducted close enough to where the buyer lives that he wants to go out there and do it himself, or if the buyer's not available, we will normally try to get an avionics tech to sit in the right seat. And during the test flight, our principal goals are, first of all, just to make sure the airplane flies straight, but second of all, to put all the avionics through their paces, and particularly things like the autopilot, make sure it'll shoot a coupled approach, all that kind of stuff. We normally try to get that done during the ferry flight, so we don't have to make a separate flight, because normally the buyer is paying for the cost of the flights and so on, and paying for the fuel, and so we try to make the ferry flight and the test flight the same flight. That doesn't always work out, so sometimes we have to make a special test flight. But again, the purpose of the test flight is mostly to make sure that all of the systems, all of the avionics, particularly things like autopilot, are fully functional, and we try to put them through their paces and make sure that everything works. And I really should have had a slide on that. I apologize, but the test flight is an important part of every pre-buy.
Okay, great. A couple of questions here. People wondering if you do any pre-buys for experimental aircraft.
We have done some. It's difficult from a couple of standpoints. One of the biggest problems we have is finding a shop that's willing to do it, because a lot of shops are uncomfortable working on experimentals, and they're uncomfortable doing pre-buys. So when you add a pre-buy to an experimental, that often crosses their threshold, and they say, "Nah, we don't think we really want to do that." So we've had quite a bit of trouble finding shops interested in doing pre-buys on experimentals, but we have done some, and it's just a little bit more of a challenge.
Okay, James is wondering, what about the factory-built special light sport aircraft?
That's an area that we have really not gotten into, and it's an area that I'm quite interested in, because it's clearly a very rapidly growing a part of general aviation. But I have to admit ignorance at the moment. I do not believe that we've ever managed a pre-buy on an SLSA.
Okay, Jake's wondering, how much should I budget for a pre-buy inspection for a Cessna 150 class aircraft?
Well, it's sometimes a little bit hard to nail down a number because of issues like what is the history of this airplane with regard to inactivity and corrosion risk, and those things sometimes affect how deeply we want to go into the inspection. But just pulling a number out of the air, I would guess for a Cessna 150, something like 4 hours would probably be sufficient. It's a pretty simple airplane. There's not that much to inspect. So I would probably start out with that number, and then say if the aircraft, if the preliminary review of the logbooks indicates that the airplane has particularly high corrosion risk, then we might want to go a little bit deeper, and maybe it would become 6 hours instead of 4 hours. But somewhere in that area, I would think.
Okay, so 4 hours maybe on the low end. And you mentioned that the Cirrus non-turbo would be 8 hours. Turbocharged Cirrus would be about 10 hours. So
right. And
that
then
seems
again,
to be about a range of hours, maybe 4 to 10 hours. What would a typical shop rate be then that you're talking about?
Well, and that varies depending on what part of the country you're in. The big metropolitan areas, let's say north of the Mason-Dixon line, the shop rates typically run around $100 an hour. Down south, they tend to be less than that. In Texas, we still sometimes see shop rates of $75 an hour, like that. But that's sort of the general ballpark. So if you figure $75 to $100 an hour, depending on where in the country you are, that's probably a pretty good guess.
Okay. Interesting question here. Gary wonders, so if during a pre-buy the maintenance shop messes up something, in other words, I guess damages the aircraft when they're working on it, doing the pre-buy, who would pay to fix that?
The shop better pay to fix it, and we would put a lot of pressure on them to do that. We've rarely, but occasionally run into an issue like that. But the having said that, the pre-buy is always pretty non-invasive. I mean, no seller is really going to allow you to do any sort of major disassembly of the aircraft, pulling cylinders or, pulling fuel tanks to see if there's corrosion underneath, that sort of thing. That pretty much goes beyond what's a reasonable scope of a pre-buy. And so if the pre-buy is relatively non-invasive, then the chances of breaking something are not that great. But, occasionally you'll have a situation like, somebody pulls the cowls to inspect the engine and puts them in a bad place and a wind gust catches one or something. And that happens occasionally. And normally if that happens, the shop makes good on it. And I don't think we've ever run into a problem where the shop didn't make good on it.
All right, Michael.
I'm just thinking we had one case where a shop pulled engine cowlings during a pre-buy, and they wound up putting the airplane back together, and the airplane flew away, and it was subsequently discovered they'd swapped the cowlings between two Cirruses, and the one that flew away with somebody else's cowling. So
oh boy,
we had to get that corrected. That was pretty embarrassing for everybody.
Yeah. So Michael's wondering, what are some common walk-away items that come up during pre-buy, and are any of these items something a buyer could spot otherwise?
Well, the big things that we worry about, probably the biggest ticket thing that we worry about is stuff like corrosion damage to a cam or lifters. Especially in Lycoming engines where the lifters can't be replaced without splitting the case, and where the cam really can't be directly inspected without splitting the case. And again, it all sort of depends on the context. If we're talking about an airplane that is close to TBO, then we don't get too excited about that, because the engine essentially is almost fully depreciated, and the buyer is not paying much more than core value for the engine. The thing that really worries us is when we're doing a pre-buy on an airplane that has a low time engine and has, let's say, been inactive for the last 6 months, and has been inactive in Orlando, or something, the corrosion capital of the universe, maybe Tampa. Those are the things that really give us a lot of heartache, because the buyer is spending a very large amount of money in anticipation that that engine will have a long, useful life and will make it to TBO. And yet we can see, just from reviewing the logbooks and looking at the inactivity and the corrosion risk that airplane's been exposed to, that the risk of that engine not making it to TBO might be pretty high. So what we do sort of depends on what kind of engine it is. If it's a big bore Continental, like in a Cirrus or a Bonanza or a Twin Cessna or something like that, that's the best possible case, because those engines, you can pull lifters and you can inspect them directly, and you can stick a bore scope or even a flashlight and a well-tuned eyeball into the vacant lifter bore and actually inspect the cam lobes directly. And so if we have a Continental powered airplane that we're concerned about, because again, it has a high time engine and it's had a period of inactivity in a high corrosion risk environment, then we will normally do a lifter pull, and that might add another 5 hours, let's say, to the pre-buy. But so it might add another $500 to the cost of the pre-buy, but we're trying to protect the buyer against a $40,000 surprise. So spending an extra $500 seems like it's pretty good insurance. If it's, and again, if that same airplane had a high time engine that was close to TBO, we probably wouldn't bother to do that, because the engine is close to run out and the buyer isn't spending a lot of money in anticipation of getting a lot more life out of the engine, so it may not be worth it. But for a low time engine, it's definitely worth it. If it's a Lycoming, it's more problematic, because Lycomings, first of all, they suffer cam and lifter problems much more frequently than Continentals, and second of all, the way they're constructed, you can't pull lifters and you can't inspect the cam directly, unless cylinders come off, and pulling cylinders off is not a reasonable thing to do during a pre-buy. It's excessively invasive and obviously very expensive as well. So on a Lycoming, we have much less ability to inspect directly, and we have to use intuition, experience, and sort of indirect methods. For example, we always, regardless of what kind of engine it is, we always do a very comprehensive borescope inspection of the cylinders. And if when we inspect the cylinders with a borescope, we discover that there's a lot of corrosion pitting in the cylinders, then logic would indicate that the risk of there also being corrosion pitting on the cam and lifters is pretty high. Now, that doesn't mean we know for sure that the cam and lifters are damaged. It just means that the probabilities are quite high that they're pitted. And so we do our best to advise the buyer and say, look, this is a high risk deal. And there are different ways to deal with that. The buyer may just want to walk away, and we say, hey, next time we do a pre-buy, let's try to find an airplane from Denver or Kansas or something instead of from Florida. Or there are other techniques we can use. For example, one strategy for a situation like that, where we have a low time, high risk engine, is to suggest that the buyer offer the seller an escrow deal, where, let's say, $20,000 of the purchase price would be put in escrow, and at the end of a year, if the engine isn't making metal and so on, then that money is released to the seller. But if the cam turns out to be coming apart, then that money is released to the buyer to finance the teardown. And that sometimes is a strategy that'll work for both the buyer and seller. But if it's a Lycoming, we sort of have to work the probabilities. If it's a Continental, at least a big bore Continental, 360, 470, 520, 550 kind of Continental, then we actually do have the ability to actually directly inspect the cam and lifters during a pre-buy, and we will typically do that if the logbook research indicates that there's a significant corrosion risk. That was
okay.
A long answer, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. A lot of information
that.
there. That's a lot of information. That's good stuff. Rudy's just wondering, what about a plane that is currently registered in Canada? Any specific problems in doing a pre-buy on a foreign registered, such as Canadian plane?
No. Doing an annual is more complicated, but doing a pre-buy is not a problem, because it's, as I said, it's a non-event as far as the regulations are concerned. So you can do anything you want. Obviously, if the airplane is in another country and the results of the pre-buy are favorable, and the buyer wants to buy it, then he has to deal with the issues of importing it into the U.S., which typically involves having a conformity check performed and signed off by an American DER and stuff like that. But that only happens once the buyer decides that he's buying the airplane and wants to import it into the U.S.
couple questions here. Kind of wondering about what if during the pre-buy the shop finds a major problem with the aircraft and it's a safety issue. Is there a way that shop can ground the aircraft or prevent the owner from flying it away?
Yeah, as long as we structure the pre-buy so it's essentially not a maintenance event, then the shop can't ground the aircraft. Obviously, both the shop and we would feel a moral obligation to inform the owner of the aircraft what was found. But then it's really up to him to make the determination as to whether to fly the aircraft away. The only time that a shop can ground an aircraft, and really that's not even the correct term, but if that discrepancy was found during an inspection where the shop is making an airworthiness determination and putting something in the logbook, then the shop couldn't sign off the aircraft as airworthy if it found some significant discrepancy. But in the case of the pre-buys, the way we like to structure them, we're not asking the shop to make an airworthiness determination. We're not asking the shop to make any logbook entries. We're just asking the shop to do a look-see and tell us what they found. And so under those circumstances, there's no paper trail that says there's anything wrong with the airplane. And it's totally up to the owner of the aircraft whether he wants to fly the airplane home in that condition or not.
Okay.
Obviously, you know, under what is it, FAR 91.7, I think is the right number. Every pilot is required to make an airworthiness determination of the aircraft every time he flies it. And this would be one of those cases.
Okay, Lee's wondering, should a pre-buy ever be done on a new aircraft, one that has not flown or maybe has just very few hours?
Well, we don't normally call that a pre-buy. Some owners who buy new airplanes want to have an acceptance, what they call an acceptance flight, and possibly an acceptance examination to make sure that everything is working properly. I've never heard that referred to as a pre-buy, but it is done, and we've actually participated in some of those. But it's normally, you know, when you buy a new airplane, you're buying it with a warranty. So the issue of who pays for what is really moot. A big part of why we do pre-buys on used airplanes are to determine what discrepancies should be paid for by the seller. Well, when you buy a new airplane, that's not an issue. The seller is the factory, and they have promised that they will pay for all discrepancies for some period of time. In the case of Cirruses, they've got a 5-year warranty on them. So a lot of why you do a pre-buy really doesn't apply to the purchase of a new airplane because of the warranty.
A number of people have asked, how do you determine your cost to supervise a pre-buy at Savvy? I'm sorry.
How do we determine it? It's a fixed price schedule. You know, for a single engine piston aircraft, we charge $750. It doesn't matter whether it's a Cessna 150 or a 210 or a Cirrus SR22 Turbo. We just have a fixed price.
And Thomas is wondering, what's a good way to find a shop that has experience in the make and model if you're looking at an aircraft that's, you know, halfway across the country?
Well, of course, that's part of what we do in our pre-buy program, but another really good way to do it, at least for a lot of makes and models, is to seek that information out from the relevant type club. Cessna Pilots Association, American Bonanza Society, International Comanche Association, and et cetera, et cetera. There are just tons of type clubs, and those tend to be a very good source of referrals to shops that have a lot of experience with those particular makes and models.
Stephen's wondering, what if the seller refuses to allow the airplane to be flown to the buyer's inspection shop, even within the 1 hour radius?
Well, I mean, that's up to the buyer, but our policy is that that's just an instantaneous deal breaker. If the seller does anything to interfere with the ability of the buyer to perform an independent pre-buy at a shop of the buyer's choice, we basically advise our client to just instantly walk away from the deal and go find another airplane. And that sometimes happens. And I would say 50% of the time when the buyer says, well, that's a deal breaker, see ya, the seller backs down, and the other 50% of the time he doesn't, and the buyer actually walks away. But frequently in these things, you need to call the seller's bluff, and it tends to be even worse when brokers are involved, because some of them tend to put really unreasonable constraints on the transaction. Some of them are great. I mean, there are a bunch of brokers we love to work with, so it's not an indictment of brokers in general. But some of them are pretty sleazy. And frequently you just have to call their bluff and say, sorry, I'm out of here, and then see what happens. And if the seller is motivated, they're not going to let the buyer walk away. They're going to make whatever concession is necessary. If the buyer isn't motivated, then if the seller isn't motivated, then the buyer may just have to walk away and find another airplane.
Jonathan wonders, what about flying your mechanic to the aircraft to do the pre-buy?
We basically have a rule that we never do that. That is done sometimes. It's not something that we're willing to do, because first of all, we think it's very unfair to the buyer's mechanic to expect them to do a workmanlike pre-buy when they're not in their hangar, don't have access to their toolbox and their jacks and their compressor and all that kind of stuff, and are working in somebody else's facility. But perhaps even more importantly, you're asking the mechanic to do this with the seller and the seller's mechanic breathing down his neck. And so we simply have a rule that we won't have anything to do with that. And if a client wants to do the pre-buy that way, we just step back and say, fine, manage it yourself. We're not going to deal with that situation. We feel very, very strongly about the independence of pre-buys, and anything that significantly compromises that independence is cause for us to not want to take responsibility for it. Because, if we manage a pre-buy and something goes wrong and the airplane turns out to have some big undisclosed problem, the client's going to be very mad at us, and so we just don't want to be involved in pre-buy situations that we think are fundamentally flawed like that. So no, we don't. We've certainly seen some transactions where the buyer has their mechanic go to where the airplane is instead of vice versa. But as a matter of policy, we just don't get involved in that sort of thing.
Gotcha. Adriano is just wondering, what's your opinion on service bulletins and compliance when you do your pre-buy?
First of all, Part 91 operators are not required to comply with service bulletins. We tend to be very selective about what service bulletins we recommend our managed maintenance clients comply with and which ones we recommend that they don't comply with. We certainly don't ever recommend compliance with all manufacturer service bulletins because a lot of them are silly and some of them are actually harmful. But some of them are very important, so we're very selective about that. And when we do a pre-buy, it's the same thing. We want to see compliance with any service bulletins that we consider to be important, but a compliance with a service bulletin is by definition not an airworthiness item, unless that service bulletin happens to be mandated by an airworthiness directive. But if it's not, then compliance with a service bulletin is by definition not an airworthiness item. It's not required by regulation, and therefore it's not something that one could expect the seller to pay for. If the buyer wants to comply with the service bulletin, he's free to do that and free to pay for it. But I feel it would not be fair to expect a seller to comply with a service bulletin, since by definition it's not required by regulation and it's not an airworthiness item. Did I lose you?
Norm is wondering, Norm is wondering, do you have a standard agreement that a buyer could use to require the conditional pre-buy examination?
We do. We have a specimen conditional purchase sale agreement on our website, which is actually it's actually a very minor modification of an agreement that AOPA provides and recommends. We've changed a little terminology there. For example, the AOPA agreement calls it a pre-purchase inspection, and we don't use the word inspection, but it's very close to the AOPA agreement. As a starting point for drafting a conditional purchase sale agreement that is fair to both sides, the AOPA agreement or the one on our website, which is very similar, are good starting points. Frequently, the purchase sale agreements provided by brokers tend to be very one-sided in favor of the seller, because after all, the broker is representing the seller. And we always ask our clients to let us review the agreement before they sign it, to make sure that it also protects the buyer's interests.
Sounds good. Barry's just wondering if it's common that shops use the long, flexible fiber optic scopes to inspect wings and tail sections and such for corrosion and things that are abnormal.
Occasionally, they're much more commonly used to inspect engines than they are to inspect airframe items. But I'm a huge fan of borescopes. Unfortunately, a lot of shops don't have borescopes, and some shops have borescopes that aren't terribly good. The whole area of borescopes has radically changed in the last year or two, because there's been a transition from optical scopes to electronic ones that do a whole lot better for reasonable cost. I mean, if it's a big turbine shop, they may have access to a $10,000 scope that would be used for turbine hot sections, but most of the shops that work on piston stuff don't have access to stuff like that. And nowadays you can get a really pretty darn good scope for $1,000, and that was not true a couple of years ago. But some shops have good ones. Some shops have not so good ones, and some shops don't have borescopes at all. So the maintenance infrastructure for piston aircraft is still sort of in transition as far as the borescope equipment is concerned.
Okay, Vince has a good one here. He said, I think it's a compliment to you. I would want to buy a Savvy maintained airplane. I would also want a pre-buy handled by someone as savvy as Savvy. So how do you resolve this relationship?
Well, that's actually something that we deal with quite a lot, particularly with Cirruses, because Savvy manages about 10% of the Cirruses in this hemisphere, and so when somebody comes to us and is interested in having a pre-buy done on a Cirrus, there's about a 10% chance that we manage that airplane already. And so we do have a protocol for handling that. And this is where a buyer approaches us to manage a pre-buy on an airplane that we're already managing for the seller. And the protocol is simply that we go to the seller and say, you have your airplane up for sale. A prospective buyer has approached us to manage a pre-buy. We will do that only with your permission and only with the understanding that if you authorize us to manage a pre-buy on the airplane, we will instantly stop representing your interests and aggressively represent the interests of the buyer until either the buyer buys the airplane or walks away from the deal. And if he buys the airplane, then it's not your problem anymore, and if he walks away from the deal, then we will resume our representation of you. But while the pre-buy is ongoing, we will not communicate with you, and our total allegiance will be to the buyer. Do you agree to let us do that? And almost always the owner of the airplane does agree to that because they want to sell the airplane. And normally the transaction goes smoothly, and we've never run into any sort of a conflict of interest situation doing it. But we are very careful about that.
Cool. Thomas is wondering, what is the timeline your company has between the time of purchase agreement and conclusion of the pre-buy?
We normally advise our clients to frequently some sort of a deadline of that sort is embodied into the purchase sale agreement, and we normally recommend that our clients who are buyers require that the agreement allow a minimum of 15 days. And the reason for that is the pre-buy itself normally doesn't take very long. A pre-buy that goes from start to finish, we look to say a Cirrus, which could be 8 or 10 hours. Normally it's done in 2 days. The biggest issue is getting the aircraft on the shop schedule, because most decent shops are booked up for a month or two in advance with annuals and that sort of thing. And so trying to find a shop that will squeeze this pre-buy in is often a challenge. And frequently we'll be in a situation where we go to 3 or 4 different shops and find out how quickly each one can accommodate the pre-buy, and wind up selecting a shop partially on that basis, how early they can get us in. But to expect a shop to just drop everything and immediately jump on a pre-buy is just not realistic. So the biggest time delay is actually getting the pre-buy on the shop schedule, getting it scheduled. We also typically want to leave at least a couple of days after the pre-buy has been completed for the final negotiations between the buyer and seller as to who pays for what and who pays how much for what, that sort of thing. But again, the biggest thing that impacts elapsed time is how quickly the pre-buy can be gotten on a shop schedule, and that's why we recommend allowing a minimum of 15 days from the time the agreement is signed to the time that the pre-buy is done.
Andy says that he's heard horror stories from pilots who bought airplanes that had fresh paint jobs, and they looked great, but had serious maintenance issues beneath the fresh paint. Is a new paint job a red flag for you on a pre-buy?
No, but it's certainly true that that buyers, particularly first-time buyers, who haven't gone through the pain of aircraft ownership, will tend to focus a lot on things like cosmetics and what kind of avionics are installed, and will tend to overlook what's going on, under the cowling and beneath the floorboards, which is really why it's so totally important to have a good pre-buy done. I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry, Tim. I had one other thing I was going to add, but it just vanished. So.
Yeah, when you're a new buyer, you're kind of filled with all that emotion.
I know what I was going to say. Yeah, the other thing we see frequently in first-time buyers is that they'll come to us to do a pre-buy on an aircraft, but in their mind they've already bought the aircraft, and they literally can't imagine not owning it. And so then we wind up doing a pre-buy and finding a bunch of problems with the aircraft, and even recommending that they walk away, or recommending that they take a fairly aggressive negotiating stance because of some issues with the airplane, and discover that no matter what we say, they are committed to buy this airplane. It's just an emotional thing. And there have been times when I've said to a client, why did you hire us to do a pre-buy when you already decided you're going to buy this airplane? What was this? Wasn't this just all a waste of time, since you're not going to pay any attention to the results? But we see that a lot with first-time buyers. Once somebody has owned their first airplane, they tend to learn a lot, and when they go buy another one, to upgrade or something, they tend to have much more realistic expectations and a lot more sophisticated view of what's going on. But first-time buyers, there are so many pitfalls that first-time buyers stumble into. And when somebody approaches us to manage a pre-buy, literally the very first question we ask is whether this is the first airplane they bought or not. Because if it is, we know that we have to deal with some very, very basic stuff that a more experienced aircraft owner would already understand and anticipate.
Great comments. Yeah, that emotion and passion kind of take over objectivity.
Right, and I mean, part of the reason for having somebody professionally manage a pre-buy is to try to take the emotion out of it. And there tends to be a lot of emotion on both sides, typically. Every seller thinks his airplane is perfect, and every buyer thinks the aircraft is grossly overpriced, and you sort of need some adult supervision in the middle to try to deal with things objectively in order to get these things to come together successfully.
Cool. Thomas just wonders, after you complete a pre-buy, do you ever do any negotiations with the seller for the buyer?
No. That's actually just a policy of ours, that we coach the buyer in his negotiations. We advise him on what positions we think he ought to take, but we do not communicate with the seller. That's the actual negotiations are handled by the buyer, not by us. But we do our best to guide him and coach him through the process.
Okay. We're getting close to the end here. Let's try and get a couple more questions in here. Vince wonders, do you have a list of Savvy maintained single-engine aircraft for sale?
Actually not. You know, it probably would be a good idea for us to keep a list of our managed maintenance clients that have their airplanes up for sale. But at the moment, I don't have a good way of putting together a list. That's an excellent idea, though. Thanks for the suggestion. I'll follow up on it.
Great. We just got another suggestion from Michelle. She just said, great idea for a future webinar, Mike. Pitfalls of a first-time buyer.
That's great. That's actually a great title, too.
It is, yeah. Pitfalls of a first-time buyer. Okay, last question here. What does Savvy look for in choosing a shop?
Oh, well, that's a whole other webinar, too. There's no short way to answer that. The only short way to answer it that I have, because I actually do have a slideshow that I do on that subject, is that we look for what we call the 3 C's, and those are competence, which means that the shop is experienced in the make and model involved, cooperative, which means that they take direction well, and communicative, which means that they're good and accessible with respect to communications, because typically the shop is at a significant distance from us and from our client, and so we absolutely rely on them communicating back and forth. Normally we do everything over the internet using a ticket system that we use to manage all of the stuff we do, including pre-buys, and we need them to be very responsive to that sort of thing. So that's sort of where the communicative part comes in. But so it's competence, cooperation, and communicativeness are the 3 key things that we look for in a shop. And finding all 3 in one place is sometimes a challenge, but that's what we're looking for.
Awesome. Good answer to a long question.
And like I say, that would make a good webinar right there.
Yeah, well, you got a couple ideas for future webinars. I know you just had given me a big long list of webinars going out into next year that we're going to be putting up on the website. So there were some really interesting titles that you got there. Really looking forward to your upcoming webinars and your continuing series here that you're doing for us. Sure do appreciate that, Mike, and spending the time with us tonight. And as always, in the future, any closing comments you want to make to the people in attendance tonight? Looks like we had over 400 on my counter here.
Oh wow, that's cool.
Yeah.
Well, I just put up the next 3 webinars that we have scheduled. October. These are all first Wednesday of the month things as we normally do. The October one is on exhaust valve failures. Should be very interesting. Have a lot of neat and gruesome pictures. The November one talks about mechanics liability and what the issues are with mechanics in terms of both getting into trouble with the FAA and being sued in civil litigation because that whole issue has a profound effect on how mechanics think and how they make the decisions that they make. So if you want to understand what ticks inside a mechanic's brain, you need to understand the whole liability issue. And then the December one we'll be talking about the perils of cylinder work and the risks involved in changing cylinders in the field while the engine is on the airplane. And we'll talk about what the risks are and how those risks can be mitigated, so that if you need to have cylinder work done, you can do it with relative confidence that the engine's not going to come apart in the next 10 hours. And finally, just two other items. I, as usual, invite you to sign up for my free monthly e-newsletter, which you can do either by going to savvyaviator.com and signing yourself up, or I believe that in the post-webinar survey that Tim would like you to take as soon as he takes control back, I think there's a way there that you can sign up for the monthly newsletter. And typically every month the newsletter comes out with 8 or 10 maintenance-related items that I think you'll find interesting. And finally, check out my almost free new book on Amazon.com. That book was basically released at AirVenture, and it's been the #1 bestseller in aviation maintenance ever since, I'm happy to say. And when I say it's almost free, it's like $10 if you get the Kindle version, and about $12 if you get it in paperback. So if you go on Amazon and search for Mike Bush's Manifesto, you'll go right to it. So, at any rate, that's all I have, Tim, and I just would like to thank everybody for attending tonight, and we'll see you next month.
Fantastic, Mike. Thank you so much for a fantastic webinar. You have a great rest of your evening, and thanks again. And to all the attendees, thank you so much for tuning in tonight. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and looking forward to hopefully having you tune in next week, where John Manette will be talking about the history of the different home-built aircraft that he's designed and built over the years. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.